Mark's currently undertaking a PhD at the Open University, and yes, I'm sure he can.
That was a good use of the word undertaking. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Can you all see me? Very good. I'm sorry I couldn't be here yesterday. I was responding to a lobbying opportunity in Westminster for animal slaughter, which is my other academic interest. And I thought about presenting you that paper, but I think you'll prefer this one. So I am a scholar of religion, and I tend to be the only one in these kinds of environments, although I do see other theologians are here. So I'm trying to look at what a religious studies perspective can offer an intersectional crowd. So I'm going to look at the assisted dying debate through the lens of spiritual closure. I obviously have my own views on this, but I'm going to do my best job at maintaining academic impartiality. But if you want to play a game, at the end, I'll poll you and you can see if you've correctly deduced which side of the debate I'm on. To prepare for this paper, I've had conversations with some of the leading groups who are working in the UK context. It's also informed by my experience of studying at McGill University, where we were taught by members of the Catholic Diocese in Montreal. Canada went through its own assisted dying debates when I was there in 2014, which passed. So they're 10 years into their journey now, more or less, which is an interesting point of reference to see where we might be going. Some background on the topic. Both Scottish and the Westminster parliaments are going through parallel assisted dying debates. Both of them are quite a unique parliamentary context. They've been arrived at independently from each other, and both were proposed by a private member's process, meaning that they were not proposed by the government. In Westminster, this is done by lottery, and in Scotland, we have a minority government, so anybody can propose a bill without the SNP's support. In Scotland, no party has a clear manifesto pledge this issue, meaning it's an issue left up to the individual members' consciences to decide. As you can see, both parliaments have had several votes on this issue within recent years, which have been roundly defeated by the members. However, despite being defeated in such a way, there is evidence of a democratic mandate. A survey carried out by campaign group Dignity in Dying in 2015 found that 82% of the British public supported assisted dying. A survey in 2019 by My Death in Dying of 2,500 people found a 90% acceptance rate. And this broadly maps onto how people on the continent feel about assisted dying as well. Same picture, new slide. It is unclear, all these details, where the devil is, whether the Scottish Government has a mandate to legislate on this. The trans right bill, which they passed last year, was subsequently abrogated by Westminster because equality is outside of the devolved competency. However, it would not have got to this state in Scotland if the presiding officer did not think it was within the devolved competency. So there's disagreement there, and we can expect further debate. Scotland is also using a definition of adults, which is 16 plus, which is not in line with the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, which they've recently signed up to, which was also a problem in the trans right debate. And the definition of illness, if you look in the Scottish case, without a reasonable chance of recovery, that could include illnesses like depression. So how we interpret on those issues will, I think, be quite important on how these votes go. Will these pass? Who knows? I wouldn't place a bet on it. But they could very easily pass. So where would we be headed? A good place to look is Switzerland. So this is the website for Dignitas, which I'm sure you've heard of. This is the clinic in Switzerland where you can go to get assisted dying. I thought that this website was interesting because it's very Web 1.0. It's up to date. It has up-to-date headlines on, but there's a certain disinvestment there. And this is illustrative of actually how fringe Dignitas is. It doesn't have the kind of visual support you might imagine. In fact, it has struggled to find premises. Several times having to operate out of the house of its founder, Ludwig Manelli. As part of its advocacy, Dignitas published a statistic on its service users. To the end of 2023, the most recent statistic, they'd welcomed 3,916 clients in total over their 25 years of operation, averaging 3 per week. 14% of those are British, so 571 in total, or around 22 per year. Comparing this to Canada, where euthanasia has been legal since 2016, around 3.5% on average, depending on how you count it, of all the dying in Canada avail themselves of assisted dying. That's 15,300 people. In one province, that's 5% of the dying. In the Netherlands, euthanasia is also 5% of the dying. If the UK goes on to match those rates post-legalisation, 5% of our dying will be 33,000 euthanasia candidates per year. 33,000 compared to the 22 who currently avail themselves of Dignitas. Just to make that case, Dignitas has a relatively modest user base, and we haven't yet heard of all the stories. In fact, if the UK removes this legislative hurdle and matches some of our neighbours, we could see a 1,650 time increase in the number of people in the UK availing themselves of assisted dying. So it does seem important to understand what motivates people and what the objections might be. This graph is from the Scottish public response when the bill first went out for consultation. It was the most responded consultation in Scottish history with 21,000 responses. The blue are the issues that concern people who partially support or fully support the bill. The yellow is those who oppose, and you can see how they differ. People who oppose are concerned with sanctity of life, eligibility being broadened and that deprecating safeguards, the risk of dividing the life of vulnerable groups, and the risks of coercion of vulnerable people to take assisted dying that they would otherwise not prefer to. People who support the bill are interested in reducing suffering, personal dignity, and personal autonomy. The Evangelical Alliance, who was on the slide earlier, said that their motivation is based on the fundamental truth that all human life is valuable. That's their statement on their website. And when I tried to approach them for quotes, they referred me back to that statement. However, in their advocacy, it's almost always focused on utilitarian arguments. In order to reach out to a presumably secular parliamentary audience, their party line is still based around preventing suffering, but it is the suffering of the members of those edge case populations identified by the yellow bars who might end up being pressured or pressuring themselves into dying. Despite these utilitarian justifications, there are spiritual foundations. For example, sanctity of life being the second biggest objection category. So what are these Christian objections, and how can understanding them help us understand this debate? If these two groups are making parallel utilitarian arguments, are they united or are they opposed? It seems critically important to understand the role of religion here. In Canada, the Catholic Church does not allow last rites or Catholic funerals for those who have undergone assisted dying. The Diocese of Vancouver, in a statement following the approval of the legislation, said that those who undergo voluntary euthanasia are manifest sinners to whom a Catholic Church funeral could not be granted without public scandal to the faithful. To quote, in the case of euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, this final action of a person's life has been chosen in violation of the clear teachings of the Church. It is an act which expresses a serious defect in belief and in unity with the faithful. It is the Church's practice that a Catholic funeral mass is not appropriate when such a wrongful act and separation of belief has taken place. Now, we've just had a talk about the importance and power of funerals. And it seems that the ability to deny someone a funeral, deny somebody communion, and deny them the last rites is a religious power structure that would be sufficient to excuse some, or not all or most of the faithful from availing themselves of assisted dying, which they might otherwise prefer to do. It's also a point here to contemplate the impact on healthcare professionals. A quote from Manelli, the guy who runs Dignitas, sometimes out of his own home. He says, as long as we are able to help them in the direction of life, we help them in the direction of life. And when this fails, we're ready to help them in the other direction. He says this sometimes involves talking people about their life for 6 hours or more, and obviously cannot be rushed. Interesting, because priests, you think, might be some of the most qualified people to have that conversation, not healthcare professionals. Providing any of these closure services could be hugely demanding emotionally for people without training. My own experience as a hospital chaplain in my early 20s was very difficult, and I learned from that end-of-life listening is a very skilled activity. And who has these skills? And how are we making sure those people with those skills are shepherding their people through this process? Moving away from these practical and prudential concerns to those theoretical offerings of religious studies I promised you earlier. This is a cracking book by William Kavanagh. He talks about how religion evolved to curb violence. He's very concerned with cycles of violence in early societies, and how all religions, whether or not they are theistic, serve to put cosmological justice and understandings for sufferings into the next world. Think about Judgment Day, or think about karma. All of these are offering what you might call closure. A similar model can be used to understand grief. When I think about my own faith, it is precisely those areas of grief and loss, or being subject to unjust violence, which draws me to religious inquiry. It is the things that will never be made right in the world, a death of loved ones being a major one, that propel me to seek explanation and undertake religious exploration. Indeed, it is a common Christian view that we do not belong to this world, and we should be preparing for the next world. And people who hold that view might spend much of their life occupied with questions of moral and spiritual readiness for death. Stepping out of my confessional view and back into my impartial posture, the process of closure that I'm talking about in an end-of-life sense could be understood as something that religious people are processing through their whole lives. And I've drawn this little diagram to maybe illustrate what I'm talking about. Religious closure could be materially different from a secular understanding of closure. It is something that is not happening at the very end of life, but rather a continuous lifelong activity, being preparedness for death. This ongoing meaning-making of the otherwise inexplicable is, from a sociological perspective, one of the main functions of religion. This is like what Adela Topelin, did I say that right? Said this morning about serial closure, something to be stood to happen over a long period. And this could be a disconnect when Christians are petitioning around end of life and what has to be done there, compared to other audiences who might have a more time-bound understanding of closure. Religious closure can be understood not only as making your peace with God and the final rites after you've been shot, but rather the flower placed in the barrel of gun before the fire squad does their inevitable work. I'll now make some examples of this from Christianity. These are resources that the faithful might draw upon. When St. Paul talks about preparing for death in his letters to Timothy, he talks about his death as being a lifelong effort in keeping the faith through life trials, emphasizing viewing death not as an end but as a transition, and his closure being in terms of completing one's calling and maintaining faithfulness rather than purely psychological terms. Elsewhere in the book of Acts, Paul states, "My only aim is to finish the race and complete the task the Lord Jesus has given me, the task of testifying to the good news of God's grace." This reinforces the idea that Paul's measured his life's completion by fulfilling his divine calling. Something that I encountered during my time studying with the diocese is that Christians are shared to call all things, the good and the bad, as part of communal spiritual development. They view it as being spiritually important that we are cared for as babies, we go on to care for others as adults, and return to needing care as we get old. The suffering at the end of life is spiritually significant because we are humbling ourselves before God, ready for the afterlife, and because we're providing opportunities for others to enter into the fullness of adulthood through providing end-of-life care. Suffering has a defining role in many theologies. From a Pauline perspective, suffering functions as a participatory identification with Christ's redemptive work, since Christians believe that God suffered in human form to know us better. In Philippians 3, Paul articulates a profound theological connection between the believer's suffering and Christology. He says, "That I may know him and the power of his resurrection, and may share his suffering, becoming like him in his death." This theological anthropology underlines position conceptualizes human suffering as potentially transformative when interpreted through Christological hermeneutics. That language is for you, Douglas.
Thank you.
Some traditions emphasize that suffering can have redemptive value. This doesn't mean suffering is inherently good, but that God can transform and use it for spiritual growth and greater purposes. Some use suffering for refinement. In Hebrews, suffering is presented as a potential divine discipline that procures a harvest of righteousness and peace. Similarly, in 1 Peter, suffering is compared to the refining of gold through fire. Suffering also provides opportunities for Christian witness and to develop compassion and empathy. In terms of wisdom and timing, it's worth noting that the debate in Canada was very wrapped up in conversations around the beginning of life. The papal encyclical against euthanasia used the same arguments as the encyclical against contraception. Out with the scope of this conference, but if anybody's interested, see me. My evangelical interlocutors, to cross the aisle into the Protestant domain, asked me to remove the quote from this slide and instead to use that one I mentioned from their website. But I've left this redacted statement up to show the issues with grasping at the theoretical underpinning of evangelical advocacy. As I mentioned earlier, they deploy utilitarian arguments, and one reason my interlocutor gave me for this is that when communicating to their member churches, they also avoid theological arguments. Because they cannot guarantee that all members of their tens of thousands of constituent member churches would line up theologically. It's just not guaranteed. There's an assumed heterodoxy of conservative values, which depends on not openly talking about these positions. When probed, my interlocutor did not offer theological objections and wasn't familiar with the Catholic ones when I brought them up. When I asked where his campaign group goes for theological guidance, like do they have an in-house priest, where they get it from, they said that they go to members of their personal network. The grassroots natures of evangelical churches and campaigning organizations mean it's hard to sense quorum and draw consensus. There is not a go-to authoritative spiritual voice like there is in the Catholic Church. This fits into a wider pattern that I've sensed in my research, which is that conservative evangelicals are culturally rather than theologically driven. Again, for more, see me. But overall, I think it's important to engage with these religious groups to understand these structural differences and differences between them. It is worth noting that there is some Christian advocacy for assisted dying. This book, I think, is fairly good. It is currently a fairly fringe view without much political reach. The Church of Wales did position themselves as being neutrally and prayerfully considering assisted dying about 10 years ago, but it is now campaigning actively against the various bills. So while a coherent position, which is occasionally, if only academically articulated, not a politically meaningful advocacy group at this time. I'll move on. One final Christian peculiarity that I think it might be insightful to consider, in case you've not encountered this before, is that it is not always viewed as being preferable to have more choices. In fact, something that I encounter time and again is that it can be harmful to be given an extra choice. Right now, I am not choosing to die, but if I'm given the option to die, the argument goes, I would have to choose not to take the option every day for the rest of my life. What does that do to me? And how does that change the economic calculus of care? Christian ethical frameworks can favor skepticism towards the assumption that maximizing individual choice necessarily constitutes a moral good. These ethical frameworks have historically maintained a complex relationship with the concept of choice maximization that differs substantially from contemporary liberal assumptions about the inherent value of expanded options. In summary, you could make someone poorer off by giving them more options. You could make the discernment process harder, or you could shift the Overton window, which is the window of conceivable outcomes, further away from comprehensive life-affirming care and over towards the potential for assisted death, which could entail worse healthcare outcomes en masse, even for those who don't go all the way to this end of the scale. The Christian moral focus on choosing the right decision through a moral framework and intercessional prayer reduces the perceived value of multiple options, as there is almost always one right option which ought to be morally preferred. This question invokes what Anscombe identifies as the distinction between thick and thin conceptions of the good. Christian ethical traditions generally maintain thick conceptions that define flourishing substantively rather than procedurally, suggesting that human fulfillment depends not merely on the quantity of available options, but on the quality of choices made in accordance with transcendence goods. In short, if you're making one right choice, why would you need an abundance of wrong choices not to be chosen? You could look here to Augustine's analysis in Confessions, but I won't right now due to time. But to put the theory in economic terms, by introducing the choice to take one's own life, every future decision has to justify the decision not taken. By allowing the Overton window of available options to include dying, we shift the window of palatability to increase a series of options less rooted in care that could make future decision-making more burdensome and might, in edge cases or otherwise, facilitate the individual making a decision which they would otherwise not have preferred. Again, I anticipate that's familiar to most of you, but just in case it wasn't. In summary, evangelical objections to assisted dyings tend to be more utilitarian, and Catholic objections to assisted dying tend to be more theological. Religious closure requires suffering by definition and can be lifelong. Christians might consider suffering desirable in some situations, including the end of life, and Christians might believe that having more options can be harmful. The Catholic Church, due to its top-down corporate structure, is more able to offer these authoritarian objections. Yes. Religious closure might be substantially different to other conceptions of closure. Teaching establishes that as a lifelong process, which might have its sociological roots in suffering and require suffering to function on a definitional level. There are underlying assumptions that are challenged by religious leaders about suffering and about choice. These differing cosmologies ought to be disarticulated to deliver meaning to the public debate. That's the end of my talk. If you email me, I'll send you these slides and I'll send you a bibliography. Before we finish, let's do the poll. So hands up if you think that I am in favor of assisted dying. Hands up if you think that I am against assisted dying. Wow, very good. And that was about 50-50. Obviously, as a social scientist, I'll never tell. But hopefully by inviting you to play this game of Inquisition, I've cultivated a careful listening in you. Thank you very much.